Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the OUR Path to Research podcast. Today we have the honor of interviewing Martin Gibala. I am your host, Paula Argudo.
I'm your co-host, Hannah Kim.
We will be interviewing Dr. Martin Gibala in the Faculty of Kinesiology.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Welcome to the Human Performance Lab.
Thank you.
Amazing. So there's some pretty fascinating research that's going on right here at the Human Performance Lab. And so that's where I would like to start the episode. What makes research here at the Human Performance Lab different from any other research that's going on on campus at McMaster?
Yeah, so our lab, there's a couple of labs like this in the Department of Kinesiology, but I think what sets us apart is we really have two labs. So we have a human performance testing lab, much like this. So we study human volunteers doing either brief bouts of exercise or training studies, and then we'll often take biological samples from them, blood samples, muscle biopsies, and analyze those samples in a more traditional biochemistry wet lab area. So I think many of us are interested in the regulation of human performance, whether that applies to health or athletic performance, but also the underlying physiology of what regulates various processes.
That's so interesting. Thank you for your answer.
And with that, can you explain to us what a day in your lab looks like?
Yeah, so a day in my lab, I'm not here that much, right? As a typical professor, okay. You're writing grants, you're writing papers, you're teaching, but a typical day in the lab here, we would have typically multiple scientific studies going on. So many human volunteers coming in to engage, as I said, in either an acute exercise bout or training studies. Often then they would undergo physiological testing. So behind us we have a metabolic cart that measures oxygen uptake, and so that's a very common test. So athletes will worry about their VO2 max, their maximal oxygen uptake, but that's also the best measure of your cardiorespiratory fitness, which is probably your most important marker of overall health. So participants come, they're tested, they're doing training studies, we're taking biological samples, and then we'll go to a different part of the lab to analyze those subsequently.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. Thank you so much.
I know you are designing all these fascinating exercise studies, and there's so many different markers to analyze, so many ways to do it. How do you decide what questions are the most important to investigate?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and so I would say we look at that two ways. So number one, is it of interest to us, right? So, and I talk to my students, of course, we need to write grants that is going to attract funding, but I hope that anything we're investigating, they're fundamentally interested in themselves. And then once we come up with a question, and this is something I've learned over many years, is it a novel question? We come up with an idea, we think it's interesting, but maybe that's been extensively studied in the literature and we just didn't know it. So once a student comes up with a question, the first thing is we'll go to the literature and find out what do we actually know about that. So that'd be part two. And then part three, of course, we need to be pragmatic about research funding. And so the question needs to be important either for human health, for basic physiology, because ultimately we're trying to convince granting agencies that this question is important. Now, sometimes that's just fundamental knowledge, but increasingly it's going to be what's the application of this research? And so for us, it's very often, how does this relate back to human health and something that is going to lead to enhancements in human health?
It's pretty interesting that research that's going right here in these machines will eventually have applications and in people's health and people's lives. Thank you.
I think our audience of the Office of Undergraduate Research are mainly students that are interested in getting involved in the field. Could you just tell us about how undergraduate students can prepare to join your lab's team, or they can get involved in other aspects of this field?
Yeah, so certainly reach out would be the first one. And so, I encourage students to contact me, and we're usually going to ask them three questions, right? And so number one is, what is it about our research that's of interest to you, right? And secondly, have you taken any courses with me? And so ideally, it's not a hard requirement, but I would like students to at least have taken an undergraduate course in my area, because that provides some background. And then we're also going to ask, and students are coming from different backgrounds, they have different ideas of where they want to go, but the question is, what's your current next step goal after graduation? And so it doesn't mean that we're only interested in people who want to pursue science. Many kinesiology students use it as a stepping stone degree into various aspects of health, but we're just trying to ask that question. So have you thought about next steps, and how might a research experience here benefit you as you move on through your program?
Okay, that's really informative. Thank you so much for your answer.
Yeah, and then also just to show that, yes, undergrad students, once they find a passion, they're also thinking like, what are our next steps? And profs are really approachable and are willing to take on these great teams. Even we had the pleasure of meeting a couple of them, and you do have an amazing team. So congrats. Cheers on
Thank you for that.
So yeah, and now that we're talking about this team, you already have, yes, these people with drive, with passion, with also this background knowledge, which is important. Now, has your team ever run into some sort of challenging situation in which you had to think outside the box? And yeah, how did you solve that?
Yeah, and another great question. Like so many laboratories, we were impacted by the pandemic, but I think for those of us doing human-based research, it obviously really impacted things, and we were shut down for a prolonged period of time, but that also stimulated some innovation. And a very specific example would be, typically when we do scientific studies or training studies, we bring participants here, they get tested in the laboratory, they train in the laboratory, but it really stimulated interest in remote or virtual training studies. And so that convinced us that first of all, we were able to do these studies. So we would film videos and we would send it to research participants. They would do the exercise themselves. We were mailing them continuous glucose monitors to attach themselves. And that work was foundational to some of the current randomized controlled trials that we're doing now. And importantly for the granting agencies, we were able to say, actually, we've done this. We've done remote virtual training and it was successful, and now we want to apply it in this subsequent study.
Yes, I was recently reading through one of the studies on, I believe it was a presentation on exercise snacks and how they could be virtual. Would you highlight any sort of interesting findings that you did with this?
Yeah, so exercise snacks, it's just a brief bout of vigorous effort that lasts a minute or so. That can be with traditional exercise equipment. It could be with body weight exercise, so we could jump up from here and do a series of air squats or burpees or something like that. Taking flights of stairs, and so it's all along this line of brief, vigorous effort can be very beneficial for your health, even as a little as 4 minutes a day.
Wow.
Of brief, vigorous exercise in scientific studies have been shown to markedly reduce your risks for all-cause mortality, developing many chronic conditions.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Well, that leads me to become curious. So, how do you communicate such complex findings in science in a way that's more beneficial to humans, and how it changes their behavior?
Yeah, I think scientists, we're taught to be careful.
Right.
We're taught to look at all of the limitations in our work, and rarely do we want to step behind what this precise measurement showed. And that's not necessarily what the public wants to hear, or too much technical detail. So I think it's important, you need to get comfortable enough with the messaging. So the way that you write a scientific paper is going to be very different for how you would write a lay article, or how you might talk to a newspaper reporter trying to communicate your research. You still have to stay true to the findings, but ideally you want to be able to talk about that in an accessible way. And so I have a colleague who's a journalist, and so we would often try and get to the point where I would say, Chris, we have to say this. And he said, but that's boring, right? And so I had to get comfortable enough with the messaging and get outside my own comfort zone a little bit and say, okay, this is good enough in trying to communicate this concept, even though it might not be precisely as rigorous a way that I would want to say it if I was writing a scientific article.
Okay, that's really informative, because I think like science literacy and science communication are one of the most important aspects that we overlook sometimes, and as students we struggle with a lot.
Absolutely, and I think it's increasingly important to be able to communicate your work to funders, to others, to say this is why the work is important, and so you're communicating to a non-expert audience. And so I think thinking about that messaging and how would you talk to, your aunt who might be interested in this but is not an expert in the field, think about that messaging.
Yes, most definitely.
Thank you. And that does have the power to change behavior at the end of the day. And so we do want to ask one more question that's a little bit not as related to research maybe, but that is very important for our audience, our undergraduate students out there. So we have exams on our courses and many are working and we have extracurriculars, but being physically active is super important. You know this better than anyone. And so is there any advice that you would like to give to our undergraduate students who want to become more physically active?
I would say we hear these messages, every little bit counts, but it's really true. We all hear the guidelines, what we should be doing, 2.5 hours a week of vigorous to moderate exercise, but that's very daunting for a lot of people. As you noted, students are very busy. And so I think remember that even a few minutes a day of a particularly vigorous effort can be very beneficial for your health. Some of my colleagues here have essentially looked at exercise snacks on learning. And so these are activity breaks. This is work from Dr. Jennifer Heiss, collaborating actually with Dr. Kim, showing that brief bouts of vigorous physical activity in between even a lecture can enhance learning outcomes. So do it for your health, but also it might actually impact on your cognitive performance and how you perform on a test as well.
Oh wow.
Going on a walk between lectures. I'll be doing it soon. So unfortunately that brings us to our very last question. Thank you so much for answering all of them.
Thank you. So we want to conclude this interview by thanking you for your time and insights. It was so informative, and I'm sure our audience found it really helpful. We want to remind our listeners that we have the Office of Undergraduate Research website where you can find information on undergraduate research, and we also have an Instagram, OUR McMaster.
Thanks for the opportunity. I am on X at Gibala M, and if I could give a quick plug for my colleague, the chair of our department, Dr. Stuart Phillips, and I are actually starting our own podcast. Starting to record episodes next week. It's going to be called Exercise Science, Hard Facts, No Hype, and those episodes should start dropping in the spring.
That's really cool. I'll definitely give it a listen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening today.